Lent is a 40-day period of fast and abstinence before Easter. It begins on Ash Wednesday and ends on Holy Saturday. Sundays are not counted as part of these 40 days because on Sundays we commemorate the resurrection of the Lord. While Lent means the spring season, it also translates the Latin term quadragesima, which means 40 days, or literally the 40th day. The 40-day period is symbolic of the 40 days that Jesus spent in the desert, a period mentioned in all the synoptic gospels. The Catholic Catechism states thus: by the solemn 40 days of Lent, the Church unites herself each year to the mystery of Jesus in the desert. By choosing the story of the temptation of Jesus as the gospel for the first Sunday in Lent, the Church gives us an orientation of how each of us must approach Lent and life itself. Every single year, whether year A, B, or C, on the first Sunday of Lent, the gospel text is chosen from the temptation scene of Matthew in year A, of Mark in year B, and of Luke in year C. The two other reasons why the Church chooses the temptation scene is first to tell us in no uncertain terms that Jesus was fully human. He was tempted like us in every single way. He went through every single experience that we go through as human beings, and therefore he can identify with us. He can understand us. He can know what we are going through. The second reason for the choice of the temptation scene is to show us how we can be like the human Jesus, and even in our humanity, which is not an excuse but an advantage because of Jesus, can overcome temptation with the grace of God like Jesus did. The three temptations of Jesus have been seen as corresponding to the temptations of those who were moving out of exile into the promised land. The temptations involved bread, testing the Lord, and idolatry. And this order is maintained in the Gospel of Matthew in his narrative of the three temptations. Luke, however, seems to have changed the order. Luke placed the testing of the Lord at the end of the temptations because for Luke, testing the Lord on the pinnacle of the Jerusalem temple is the climax. The Gospel of Luke begins in the temple, and the Gospel of Luke ends in the temple. The temple is the beginning and end, and that is why in Luke's Gospel, the third temptation is where Jesus is asked to throw himself down to test God from the pinnacle of the temple. In Luke, unlike in Matthew and Mark, the temptations come after the period of 40 days and thus highlight the fact that Jesus would have been vulnerable. Jesus would have been physically weak. He would have been weakened by hunger. This is why the first temptation arises out of the physical need of Jesus. Unlike in Matthew, the temptation is not to turn stones into bread. In Luke, Jesus is challenged to turn this stone into a loaf of bread. While this may be understood as a temptation to perform a popular or magical sign, it seems better to understand it as a temptation to use his power for his own benefit. It is a temptation to be selfish and to satisfy his own needs. It is also a temptation to concern himself with the material alone, as is evident in the response of Jesus. There is much more, Jesus says, that sustains the human than mere physical satisfaction. So many of us, given so easily to this temptation of selfishness, of self-centeredness. When we look at the few rich in the world who accumulate and gather so much for themselves, even at the cost of others, it is really a crime. They give in so easily to temptation. They satisfy their lust, they satisfy their wants, they satisfy their cravings. This temptation is a challenge to those of us who of that ilk, to say to ourselves, it is true that I need bread. It is true that I have need of the daily necessities of life, but I need to stop at times and ask myself, how much is enough? Will I keep accumulating and gathering, even at the cost of others having less, or so many having nothing at all? Or will I be a little generous and share? Will I respond like Jesus to say that we do not live on the material alone? The material is necessary and required, but it must have its place and not overtake us. The second temptation is to acquire power and authority and dominion by worshiping Satan. It is really a temptation to take the easy way than the right way. It is a temptation to compromise. Jesus' response is that there is only one way to gain authority, power, and dominion, and that is by worshiping God, not worshiping things or persons. Authority, in Jesus' view, means service and not domination. So if Jesus wants to be in charge, he will be in charge by reaching out to others, by a kind word, by a helpful gesture, by a deed which enhances and boosts someone up. In the third and final temptation, the devil quotes scripture, since Jesus has twice used scripture to overcome the previous two temptations. This temptation is to put God to the test. Jesus' response with words taken from the book of Deuteronomy is clear and unambiguous. God is to be worshipped and obeyed and not put to the test. The final verse in Luke, which states that the devil left him till an opportune time, is Luke's way of saying that Jesus continued to be tempted throughout his life. It is likely that some of us might imagine that Jesus had only 3 temptations. Luke reminds us in chapter 4, verse 13, the last verse of today's gospel, that this was not so, that Jesus continued and the devil looked for opportunities to keep tempting him. Temptation by the devil was constant and regular in the life of Jesus. This is evident in the numerous requests that continued to be made of Jesus for signs and wonders. It is evident in the Garden of Gethsemane when he was sorely tempted to opt for the easy way rather than the way of the cross. Jesus, like he did in the desert, overcame those temptations and challenges us through his action to do the same as we enter the season of Lent. The uniqueness of Jesus is not merely that he was without sin, that he did not give in to temptation, but that even after being tempted, he continued to remain above temptation. Thus, the temptation must be interpreted as the constant struggle or conflict between God's reign and the reign of Satan or evil. This struggle continues today after the death and resurrection of Jesus. we continue to be lured by numerous temptations. One of these is the temptation to be successful at all costs, even if it means belittling others or riding roughshod over them. Other temptations are to have more rather than to be more, or to choose the easy way rather than the right way, or to sit on the fence rather than take a stand, or to take the broad road rather than the road of pain and sacrifice, or even to focus too much on the external, even at cost to the internal. How are we to overcome these temptations? What must be our response in the face of such temptations? We do not need to look far or go to manuals and ethics or even listen to the counsel of the wise. We have an outstanding and practical example of how to overcome temptations in Jesus and his response. In a word, the temptations are not so much about the temptations themselves or even about Satan and the attempts that Satan makes to lure us away from mission. They are about the focus and the commitment of Jesus. They are about his pointed dedication to God. We're offered today an example to follow and to imitate. To be sure, the story of the temptation does not give us ready-made answers to all the allurements and enticements which we will face every day, but they do point us in a direction which at times remain a response in which God's will rather than his own took primacy. As we begin this grace-filled season of Lent, we are invited and challenged by Jesus' response to Satan. We are invited and challenged to make Jesus' response our own. Will we do so from today?